The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Mitchell pressed her palms against the cold metal of the examination table, trying to steady herself. The Veterans Affairs Clinic smelled like disinfectant and desperation, a combination she'd grown to hate over the past 18 months. Her left leg throbbed with that familiar ache that medication could barely touch anymore, a constant reminder of the IED that had changed everything. Sarah Mitchell. A voice called from the doorway. She looked up to see a woman in navy blue scrubs, clipboard in hand, scanning the waiting room with professional efficiency. The woman's dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and there was something about her posture that spoke of military training even in civilian clothes. Sarah raised her hand slightly, the gesture feeling heavier than it should. "That's me." The woman approached with confident strides, her brown eyes taking in Sarah's appearance with what seemed like more than routine assessment. There was a depth there that suggested she understood more than most medical professionals about the invisible wounds that often hurt worse than the visible ones. Imelina Rodriguez, nurse practitioner. I'll be handling your appointment today, since Dr. Hendricks had an emergency. Elena's voice carried a slight accent, warm but controlled. I see this as a follow-up for your leg injury, and some additional concerns you wanted to discuss. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. These appointments always left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in ways that her 3 tours in Afghanistan never had. At least in combat, she'd known who the enemy was. Here, fighting her own body and mind, the lines weren't so clear. Elena gestured toward the examination room, and Sarah followed, her slight limp more pronounced after sitting for the past hour in the cramped waiting area. The small room felt even smaller once they were both inside, Elena closing the door with a soft click that somehow felt final. "Before we start, I want you to know that whatever we discuss stays between us unless you're in immediate danger," Elena said, settling in her chair and pulling up Sarah's file on the computer. "I've read through your medical history, but I'd like you to tell me in your own words what's been going on." Sarah perched on the edge of the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her. Where did she even begin? With the nightmares that had her waking up in cold sweats, calling out commands to soldiers who weren't there? With the way crowds made her feel like her skin was crawling, every stranger a potential threat? With the guilt that ate at her daily because she'd made it home when 3 members of her unit hadn't? The leg's been acting up more lately. She started with the physical because that was easier, especially when it rains. The shrapnel they couldn't remove shifts around, and the pain gets pretty intense. Elena nodded, making notes. On a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say your average daily pain level is? 6, maybe 7 on bad days. Sarah paused. "But that's not really why I'm here." Elena's fingers stilled on the keyboard, and she turned to give Sarah her full attention. There was something in her expression that reminded Sarah of the medics she'd worked with downrange, that ability to see past the immediate injury to the deeper wounds underneath. "Tell me what is bringing you here, then." The word stuck in Sarah's throat for a moment. She'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but sitting here now, facing this woman who somehow managed to look both professional and genuinely caring, everything she planned to say seemed inadequate. "I can't sleep without medication, and even then, it's maybe 4 hours if I'm lucky," she finally said. "I keep having the same dream, over and over. We're on patrol, and I know something's wrong, but I can't warn anyone in time. The explosion happens, and I wake up trying to perform triage on my pillowcase." Elena's expression didn't change, didn't show the pity or discomfort that Sarah had grown accustomed to seeing when she talked about her experiences. Instead, there was recognition there, as if she understood exactly what Sarah was describing. "How long has this been going on?" "Since I got back. 18 months now." Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Everyone keeps telling me it'll get better with time, that I need to be patient with the healing process. But it's not getting better. If anything, it's getting worse." Elena saved her notes and turned back to Sarah, her attention completely focused. "What about during the day? How are you managing with daily activities, work, social situations. Sarah let out a bitter laugh. Work? I got discharged on medical disability. Can't handle being around heavy machinery with the way my hands shake sometimes. Social situations? She shook her head. I went to my unit's homecoming barbecue last month. Lasted about 20 minutes before I had to leave. Too many people, too much noise. I felt like I was going to crawl out of my own skin. That sounds incredibly isolating. The simple acknowledgement hit Sarah harder than any of the well-meaning but hollow encouragements she'd received from friends and family. Elena wasn't trying to fix her or minimize her experience. She was just witnessing it, and somehow that felt more healing than anything else Sarah had encountered in months of medical appointments. It is, Sarah admitted. I feel like I'm disappearing a little more each day. Like the person I used to be is just fading away, and I don't know how to get her back. Elena was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see her choosing her words carefully. Sarah, what I'm hearing suggests that you might be dealing with more than just the physical trauma from your injury. Have you ever been evaluated for PTSD? The acronym hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Sarah had heard it whispered by other veterans, had seen the knowing looks when someone mentioned seeking help for invisible wounds. There was still a stigma attached to it, even among people who should know better. A couple of doctors have mentioned it, Sarah said slowly. But I don't know. I wasn't in direct combat that often. I was a vehicle mechanic, not infantry. I feel like I don't have the right to claim something like that. Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but firm. Sarah, trauma doesn't discriminate based on your military occupation specialty. You were deployed in a combat zone for 3 tours. You witnessed things, experienced things that most people never will. And then you survived an explosion that killed 3 of your teammates. Your brain is trying to process all of that, and sometimes it gets stuck in survival mode. The validation hit Sarah like a physical force. For the first time since coming home, someone was telling her that her reactions were normal, understandable even. She felt tears pricking at her eyes and blinked them back quickly. What happens now, she asked. Now we start figuring out how to help you, Elena said. There are treatment options, therapy approaches that have shown real success with veterans dealing with PTSD. It's not going to be quick or easy, but there's a path forward. Elena pulled out a business card and wrote something on the back. This is Dr. Marcus Thompson. He specializes in trauma therapy for veterans, and he's someone I trust. I'm also going to set you up with our psychiatrist here to talk about medication options that might help with the sleep issues and anxiety while you're working through the therapy process. Sarah took the card, surprised to find her hands weren't shaking for once. Why are you helping me like this? I mean, going above and beyond. Elena was quiet for a moment, and Sarah caught something flickering across her face, a shadow of recognition, of shared understanding. Because everyone deserves to find their way back to themselves, she said simply, and sometimes it helps to have someone who understands the journey. There was something in the way Elena said it that made Sarah wonder about her own story, but she didn't push. Instead, she tucked the business card carefully into her wallet, treating it like the lifeline it felt like. I want you to know, Elena continued, that seeking help doesn't make you weak. It makes you brave. You've already survived the hardest part. Now we're going to help you learn to live again, not just survive. As Sarah prepared to leave, Elena handed her a small card with her direct number. If you need someone to talk to before your appointment with Dr. Thompson, call me. Sometimes the hardest part is just getting started. Walking out of the clinic that day, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 months. Hope. It was fragile, tentative like a seedling pushing through concrete, but it was there. Elena had seen her, really seen her, without judgment or pity. For the first time since coming home, Sarah didn't feel completely alone. The drive back to her apartment took her through the downtown area where other veterans sometimes gathered at a small coffee shop called The Bunker. She'd driven past it dozens of times, but never stopped. Today, on impulse, she pulled into the parking lot. Inside, the atmosphere was different from typical coffee shops. Quieter somehow, despite the conversation happening at several tables. Sarah recognized the particular way veterans carried themselves, alert but trying to appear relaxed, always aware of exits and potential threats even in the safest environments. She ordered a coffee and found a table in the corner where she could watch the door. As she sat there, she thought about Elena's words. Everyone deserves to find their way back to themselves. For so long, Sarah had felt like she was broken beyond repair, that the explosion had destroyed not just her leg, but her entire sense of self. But sitting in this coffee shop, surrounded by other people who might understand her struggles, holding a business card for a therapist who specialized in helping veterans heal, Sarah began to think that maybe she wasn't as lost as she believed. Maybe the journey back to herself was possible after all. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. How did the appointment go? For once, Sarah had an honest answer that wasn't completely bleak. Better than expected. I think I might have found some real help this time. As she typed the response, Sarah realized that Elena had done more than just provide medical care. She'd given Sarah something precious that she'd been missing, the belief that healing was possible, and that she wasn't alone in the fight to reclaim her life. The afternoon sun streamed through the coffee shop window, and for the first time in months, Sarah didn't feel the urge to find a different seat away from the light. Instead, she sat there, letting the warmth touch her face, and began to imagine what it might feel like to wake up tomorrow without the weight of dread that had become her constant companion. It was just the beginning, she knew. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with setbacks and breakthroughs in equal measure. But Elena had shown her that the destination was worth fighting for, and that she didn't have to make the journey alone. As Sarah finally stood to leave, she caught her reflection in the coffee shop window. The woman looking back at her still carried the shadows of trauma, still bore the invisible scars of war. But there was something else there now, something that had been missing for so long she'd almost forgotten what it looked like. The spark of someone who believed in the possibility of tomorrow being better than today. The drive home felt different somehow, less like retreat and more like regrouping. Sarah pulled into her apartment complex and sat in the car for a moment, watching other residents go about their daily lives. Soon, she promised herself, she would rejoin that world. Soon, with help, she would find her way back to the person she used to be, or maybe, if she was lucky, discover someone even stronger than before. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's appointment with Elena, and the business card for Dr. Thompson had become worn from being handled so many times. She'd picked up the phone to call his office at least a dozen times, only to hang up before dialing. Today, sitting in the bunker coffee shop that had become her regular refuge, she finally forced herself to make the call. Dr. Thompson's office. This is Maria speaking. Im Saramitsi. I was referred by Elena Rodriguez at the VA clinic for therapy sessions. Of course, Ms. Mitchell. Elena mentioned you might be calling. Dr. Thompson has an opening Thursday afternoon, if that works for you. Sarah's heart hammered as she confirmed the appointment. Thursday was only 2 days away. After 18 months of struggling alone, 2 days felt both too soon and not soon enough. As she ended the call, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Hi, Sarah. This is Elena from the clinic. Just checking in to see how you're doing. No need to respond if you're not comfortable, but know that I'm thinking about you. The message surprised Sarah. In her experience, medical professionals didn't typically follow up personally unless something was seriously wrong. She stared at the text for several minutes before typing back. Thank you for checking. I made an appointment with Dr. Thompson for Thursday. Nervous, but ready to try. Elena's response came quickly. That's wonderful news. Being nervous is completely normal. You're taking a brave step. If you need someone to talk to before or after your appointment, my offer still stands. There was something about Elena's consistent kindness that both comforted and puzzled Sarah. She'd encountered plenty of caring medical professionals over the years, but Elena's attention felt more personal, more invested. Sarah found herself wondering about Elena's background, what had led her to work with veterans, and why she seemed to understand trauma with such intimate knowledge. Thursday arrived gray and rainy, which made Sarah's leg ache more than usual. She arrived at Dr. Thompson's office 15 minutes early, partly from nerves and partly from the military habit of being early to everything. The waiting room was designed to be calming, soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and none of the sterile, institutional feeling of the VA clinic. Dr. Thompson turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s with kind eyes and an unhurried manner that immediately put Sarah at ease. His office was filled with books and had a small American flag on his desk, but he wore civilian clothes and spoke without the formal distance she'd expected. "Elena speaks very highly of you," he began after they'd settled into their chairs. "She mentioned that you've been struggling since returning from deployment. Can you tell me a bit about what that's been like for you?" Something about his tone invited honesty rather than demanding it. Sarah found herself telling him about the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the way crowds made her feel trapped. She described the guilt she carried about surviving when others hadn't, and the growing sense that she was becoming invisible even to herself. "You mentioned guilt about surviving," Dr. Thompson said gently. "That's something called survivor's guilt, and it's incredibly common among veterans who've lost teammates. Can you tell me more about what happened that day?" Sarah had never spoken the full story aloud to anyone. The official reports were clinical, factual, stripped of the human elements that made the experience traumatic. But here, in this quiet office with rain pattering against the windows, she found herself describing that morning in detail. They'd been doing routine maintenance on convoy vehicles at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Sarah was under the hood of a Humvee when the mortar rounds started falling. The first few landed outside the perimeter, but then the incoming got closer, more accurate. Staff Sergeant Williams had shouted for everyone to take cover, but Rodriguez was still working on the other side of the motor pool. "I could see him through the vehicle bay," Sarah said, her voice becoming distant. Martinez and Johnson were with him. They were too far from the bunkers when the round hit. I remember the heat, the way everything went silent for a few seconds before the screaming started. Dr. Thompson listened without interrupting, his expression compassionate but professional. "What happened next?" "I tried to get to them. My leg was messed up pretty bad from the shrapnel, but I could still move. When I reached Rodriguez, there wasn't much left. Martinez was conscious but bleeding out, and Johnson was unconscious but breathing. I worked on Martinez first, because he seemed like he had the best chance." Sarah's hands had begun to shake, and she clasped them together tightly. "I did everything I knew how to do. Applied pressure to the wounds, tried to keep him talking. But we were taking more incoming, and the medics couldn't get to us right away. He died while I was holding pressure on his femoral artery. Bled out in my hands. The silence that followed felt heavy, but not uncomfortable." Dr. Thompson waited until Sarah was ready to continue. "Johnson made it to the field hospital, but died in surgery. 3 guys who'd been joking around with me 20 minutes earlier were gone, and I walked away with a bum leg and some scars. How does that make sense?" "It doesn't make sense," Dr. Thompson said simply. "And that's one of the hardest things about trauma. Our minds keep trying to find logic in something that was fundamentally random and unfair. You survived not because you deserved it more than they did, but because of chance, positioning, timing, factors completely beyond your control." "But I was a mechanic," Sarah said, voicing the thought that had haunted her for months. "I knew basic first aid, but I wasn't a medic. Maybe if someone with better training had been there, Martinez would have made it. Or maybe that person would have been killed too. Sarah, you did everything you could with the training and resources you had in an incredibly dangerous situation. The fact that you tried to help while injured yourself shows extraordinary courage." He explained how trauma could become locked in the nervous system, how her brain was essentially stuck in survival mode, even though the danger was over. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty sleeping, these aren't character flaws, he said. They're your nervous system's way of trying to keep you safe. The problem is that these responses, which were adaptive in a combat zone, become maladaptive in civilian life. As their session neared its end, Dr. Thompson outlined a treatment plan that included both traditional talk therapy and EMDR, a movement desensitization, and reprocessing, a technique specifically designed to help process traumatic memories. Recovery isn't linear, he warned as Sarah prepared to leave. There will be setbacks along with breakthroughs. But based on our conversation today, I believe you have the strength to work through this. Driving home from the appointment, Sarah felt emotionally drained, but oddly hopeful. For the first time, someone had given her a framework for understanding what was happening to her. Her symptoms weren't proof of weakness or failure. They were evidence of a nervous system that had been pushed beyond its limits and was struggling to readjust. Her phone rang as she pulled into her apartment parking lot. Elena's number appeared on the screen. "Hi, Sarah. I hope you don't mind me calling. I want to check in and see how your appointment went." "It was intense," Sarah said honestly. "But good, I think. He helped me understand some things about why I've been struggling so much." "That's wonderful. Dr. Thompson has a gift for helping people make sense of their experiences." Elena paused. "I don't want to overstep, but would you be interested in meeting for coffee sometime? Not as a medical professional, but just as someone who might understand some of what you're going through." The invitation surprised Sarah. "You mean like as friends?" "Yes, exactly like that. I know it might seem unusual, but I think sometimes the healing process benefits from connections with people who get it. Of course, no pressure at all if you're not comfortable with that." Sarah found herself saying yes before she'd fully processed the offer. They arranged to meet at the bunker the following Saturday afternoon, and as Sarah hung up, she realized she was looking forward to it in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in months. Saturday came with unseasonably warm weather for early spring. Sarah arrived at the bunker to find Elena already there, looking different in jeans and a casual sweater than she had in her medical scrubs. She seemed younger somehow, less formal, though no less substantial. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Elena said as Sarah sat down with her coffee. "I'll be honest, I don't usually suggest meeting patients outside of work, but there was something about your situation that felt familiar." "Familiar how?" Elena was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "I'm a veteran too. Marines, deployed to Iraq twice between 2008 and 2012. I became a nurse practitioner after I got out, specifically to work with veterans because I knew how hard it could be to find medical professionals who really understood the military experience." The revelation reframed everything Sarah had noticed about Elena: the military bearing, the deep understanding of trauma, the personal investment in Sarah's healing. "Is that why you followed up with me? Because you recognized something?" "Partly," Elena admitted, "but also because I could see you trying to disappear, and I remembered what that felt like. After my second deployment, I spent about 6 months convinced that I was broken beyond repair. I had this idea that if I could just stay invisible enough, maybe the pain would fade on its own." "Did it work?" Elena laughed, but there was no humor in it. Not even a little bit. If anything, isolation made everything worse. It wasn't until I started getting real help and connecting with other veterans who understood what I was dealing with that I began to heal. They talked for over 2 hours, sharing stories and experiences with the easy familiarity of people who'd served in similar circumstances. Elena described her own struggles with PTSD after losing several Marines in her unit to an IED attack, and how therapy had helped her process the trauma without minimizing its impact. "The thing about trauma," Elena said, "is that it tries to convince you that you're alone with your pain. But the truth is, so many of us are carrying similar wounds. There's something powerful about realizing you're not the only one who wakes up in the middle of the night checking door locks, or who can't handle crowds anymore." As they prepared to leave, Elena handed Sarah another card. "This is for a support group I help facilitate. It's specifically for female veterans dealing with combat-related trauma. It meets Tuesday evenings at the community center. You don't have to participate if you're not ready, but you're welcome to just come and listen." Walking to her car, Sarah felt like something fundamental had shifted. Elena had offered her something precious, not just professional support, but genuine friendship and community. For the first time since coming home, Sarah could envision a future where she wasn't defined entirely by her trauma, where she might find meaning and connection again. That evening, she called her sister for the first time in weeks. "Hey Jess, it's me. I know I've been pretty absent lately, but I wanted you to know that I'm getting help. Real help this time. Oh, Sarah, that's such good news. What changed? I met someone who helped me understand that I don't have to figure this out alone, Sarah said, thinking of both Elena and Dr. Thompson. Turns out there are people who get it, who've been where I am and found their way through. As she hung up the phone, Sarah looked at the support group card Elena had given her. Tuesday was 4 days away. It would mean walking into a room full of strangers and potentially sharing her story with people she'd never met. 6 months ago, the thought would have been paralyzing. Now, it felt like another step toward reclaiming her life. The nightmares still came, and her legs still ached on rainy days. But for the first time since coming home, Sarah fell asleep that night without the crushing weight of hopelessness that had become her constant companion. Change was possible. Healing was possible. And she was no longer facing the journey alone. Sarah stood outside the community center on Tuesday evening, her heart racing as she stared at the modest building where Elena's support group met. Through the large windows, she could see a circle of chairs in what looked like a multi-purpose room, with a few women already seated and talking quietly. The scene looked ordinary enough, but Sarah's nervous system was treating it like a combat situation. Heightened alertness, shallow breathing, the overwhelming urge to retreat to safety. She'd driven past the building twice already, unable to force herself to park and go inside. This was harder than her first therapy session with Dr. Thompson, harder even than that initial appointment with Elena. Those have been one-on-one situations where she could control the narrative. This would require sitting in a circle with strangers and potentially exposing her deepest vulnerabilities to people she'd never met. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Hey, if you're planning to come tonight, we're just getting started. No pressure, though. You can join us whenever you're ready, even if it's not tonight. The gentle encouragement helped slow Sarah's racing thoughts. She took a deep breath, locked her car, and walked toward the building before she could change her mind again. Inside, the room was warm and welcoming with soft lighting and a coffee station set up in one corner. 8 women sat in the circle of chairs, ranging in age from what looked like early 20s to perhaps 60. Elena caught her eye and smiled, gesturing to an empty chair next to her. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Sarah, Elena said as she settled into the chair. She's a veteran who's been working through some things, and I thought our group might be helpful. The women offered friendly nods and quiet hellos, but Sarah was struck by how none of them pushed for more information or made her feel like she needed to immediately share her story. There was an understanding here, an implicit recognition that everyone carried their own burdens and would share them when ready. We were just doing our check-ins, explained a woman across the circle who appeared to be in her 40s. She had short auburn hair and spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to leadership. I'm Major Janet Sullivan, retired Army. Would you like to share how your week went? Or would you prefer to listen tonight? Listen, if that's okay, Sarah said, grateful for the option. Absolutely. That's how most of us started. As the women went around the circle, sharing their weekly experiences, Sarah began to understand the power of what Elena had invited her into. These weren't just casual conversations. They were structured check-ins that allowed each person to be heard and supported without judgment. A young woman named Maria, who couldn't have been more than 25, talked about struggling with nightmares after her deployment to Syria. Her story resonated painfully with Sarah's own experience. The same hypervigilance, the same guilt about surviving when others hadn't. I keep thinking I should be grateful to be alive, Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. But most days I feel like I'm just going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Several women nodded in recognition, and Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. Maria had just articulated something Sarah had been feeling, but couldn't put into words. An older woman named Patricia shared about her ongoing struggle with crowds and loud noises 20 years after her service in the Gulf War. Some people think I should be over it by now, she said with bitter humor, as if trauma has an expiration date. The timeline pressure is real, agreed another woman, Captain Lisa Chun, who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a helicopter pilot. I think civilians want us to heal according to their comfort level, not according to what we actually need. When it was Elena's turn, she shared something that surprised Sarah. Despite her role as facilitator and her obvious progress in healing, Elena talked about still having difficult days, moments when the trauma tried to convince her she was weak or broken. Yesterday, I had a panic attack in the grocery store because someone dropped a can of soup and it made a loud bang, Elena said matter-of-factly. For about 10 minutes, I was right back in Fallujah, convinced I was under attack. Recovery isn't a straight line, and healing doesn't mean the trauma never touches you again. It means you develop better tools for managing those moments when it does. After check-ins, the group moved into a more structured discussion about coping strategies. They talked about grounding techniques for managing flashbacks, ways to communicate needs to family members who hadn't served, and practical approaches to handling triggered responses in daily situations. One thing that's helped me, said Janet, is keeping what I call an evidence list, concrete reminders of my progress that I can look at when my brain tries to convince me I'm not healing. Things like, I went to the grocery store without having a panic attack, or I slept 4 hours straight last night without nightmares. Sarah found herself taking mental notes throughout the evening. These women weren't just surviving their trauma. They were actively working to transform it, supporting each other through setbacks, and celebrating small victories with the enthusiasm of people who understood how hard won they were. As the formal meeting wound down, several women lingered for informal conversation. Maria approached Sarah hesitantly. I'm really glad Elena invited you, she said. When you said you wanted to just listen tonight, I remembered feeling exactly the same way my first time here. It felt too risky to speak, but I needed to hear that other people had experiences like mine. How long have you been coming? Sarah asked. About 8 months now. It's been life-changing, honestly. Not because it fixed everything, but because it helped me realize I wasn't broken beyond repair. Maria glanced around at the other women, who were cleaning up chairs and chatting in small groups. These women saved my life, just by showing me that recovery was possible. Elena appeared beside them, keys in hand. How did the night feel? She asked Sarah. Overwhelming, but in a good way, I think, Sarah replied honestly. I kept hearing pieces of my own story in what everyone shared. It's strange to feel so understood by people I just met. That's the magic of shared experience, Elena said. Not that our stories are identical, but the emotional landscape is familiar. The guilt, the hypervigilance, the feeling of being disconnected from the person you used to be, those are common threads that bind a lot of our experiences together. As they walked to the parking lot together, Elena continued, I want you to know that if you decide this group isn't the right fit, that's completely fine. There are other options, other ways to build community and support. But if you do want to keep coming, you're welcome here for as long as it's helpful. I want to keep coming, Sarah said without hesitation. Tonight felt like the first time since I got back that I wasn't carrying my story alone. Over the following weeks, Sarah established a routine that began to provide structure and hope to her days. Twice weekly sessions with Dr. Thompson helped her process the trauma through EMDR therapy, while the Tuesday evening support group gave her a community of people who understood her journey intimately. Dr. Thompson's approach proved different from any therapy Sarah had experienced before. Instead of just talking through her memories, the EMDR process helped her brain reprocess the traumatic events in a way that reduced their emotional charge. After several sessions, Sarah noticed that she could think about the mortar attack without being immediately transported back to that day. The goal isn't to forget what happened, Dr. Thompson explained during one of their sessions. It's to help your brain file the memory as something that happened in the past, rather than something that's still happening in the present. The support group became equally important to her healing process. Each week, Sarah watched these women navigate their own challenges while supporting each other through setbacks and breakthroughs. She began to participate more actively in discussions, sharing her own struggles and insights. During one particularly difficult meeting, Maria had a panic attack while describing a recent nightmare. Rather than being overwhelmed by someone else's crisis, Sarah found herself responding with the same steady competence she'd once brought to mechanical emergencies. She helped talk Maria through grounding exercises while Elena managed the overall situation. "You were amazing with Maria tonight," Patricia told Sarah after the meeting. "You have natural healing instincts." The comment planted a seed of an idea that Sarah wasn't quite ready to examine fully. For so long, she'd defined herself by what she could no longer do. The military career cut short, the civilian job she couldn't handle. But maybe there were things she could do, ways she could use her experience to help others on similar journeys. One evening after group, Elena asked Sarah if she'd be interested in co-facilitating a new support group they were starting for newer veterans. "You have a way of making people feel seen and heard," Elena explained. "And I think sharing your story from the perspective of someone actively working through recovery could be powerful for people who are just starting their healing journey." The invitation terrified and excited Sarah in equal measure. 6 months ago, she'd been convinced she had nothing valuable to offer anyone. Now, Elena was suggesting that her experience, including her struggles, could be a source of strength and guidance for others. "I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that," Sarah said. "What qualifications do you think you need beyond lived experience and genuine compassion?" Elena countered. "Some of the most healing interactions I've ever had weren't with trained professionals, but with other veterans who'd been where I was and could show me that recovery was possible." Sarah agreed to think about it, but privately she was already imagining what it might look like to turn her pain into purpose. The idea of helping other veterans navigate their own healing journeys felt like it could give meaning to everything she'd endured. Her relationship with her family began to improve as well. Sarah started calling her sister regularly and even accepted an invitation to dinner with her parents, something she'd avoided for months because family gatherings had felt too overwhelming. "You seem different," her sister Jess observed during one of their phone conversations. "Stronger somehow, but also more like yourself than you've been in a long time." "I'm learning that healing doesn't mean going back to who I was before," Sarah explained. "It means integrating what happened to me into who I'm becoming. The trauma is part of my story now, but it doesn't have to be the whole story." The support group had taught her that recovery wasn't about returning to some previous version of herself, but about moving forward into a new version that included her experiences without being defined entirely by them. She was learning to carry her scars with dignity rather than shame. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the community center after group, she noticed a young woman sitting in the parking lot in her car, clearly distressed. Sarah recognized the look. The same expression of desperate uncertainty she'd worn 6 months earlier outside the VA clinic. Without overthinking it, Sarah approached the car and tapped gently on the window. The woman looked up with startled, red-rimmed eyes. "Hey, I'm Sarah. I just came from a support group for women veterans inside. You look like you might be struggling with something. Would you like to talk, or maybe come inside and listen for a bit?" The woman's face crumpled with relief. "I'm sorry. I've been sitting out here for an hour trying to work up the courage to go in. I'm Rachel. I got back from Afghanistan 3 months ago, and I'm not doing so well. 3 months ago, I was sitting in my car outside the VA clinic having a complete breakdown," Sarah said gently. "It gets better, but it takes time and support. Would you like me to walk in with you?" As Sarah led Rachel into the building, where Elena was still cleaning up from group, she realized that somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being just a patient or group member. She'd become someone who could offer hope and guidance to others starting their own healing journeys. Elena looked up as they entered and smiled with warm recognition, not just at Sarah, but at the familiar dynamic of one veteran helping another take their first steps toward recovery. "Elena, this is Rachel," Sarah said. "She's been sitting outside working up the courage to come in. I thought maybe we could tell her a bit about what we do here." As the 3 women sat down to talk, Sarah felt a profound shift in her understanding of her own purpose. The trauma that had nearly destroyed her was becoming the foundation for helping others navigate their own recovery. She wasn't just healing, she was becoming a healer. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the front of a room in the same community center where she'd first found her voice, preparing to co-facilitate her third support group meeting. The circle of chairs was filled with 8 newer veterans, including Rachel, who had become not just a regular attendee, but a close friend. Sarah's hands no longer shook when she spoke to groups, and the hypervigilance that had once made public speaking impossible had transformed into a heightened awareness that helped her read the emotional needs of the room. Before we begin tonight, I want to remind everyone that this is a safe space, Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from lived experience. What's shared here stays here, and there's no pressure to speak until you're ready. Some of you have been coming for a few months, others are here for the first time. Wherever you are in your journey, you belong here. Elena sat in the circle as a participant rather than a leader tonight, allowing Sarah to take the primary facilitator role. It was part of Sarah's gradual transition into becoming a peer counselor, a path that had emerged naturally from her gift for helping others feel seen and understood. As the group moved through check-ins, Sarah found herself marveling at how much had changed since that first terrifying night when she'd almost turned around and driven home. The woman who'd been convinced she was broken beyond repair was now helping others discover their own capacity for healing. A new group member, Specialist David Chun, was sharing for the first time about his struggles since returning from a deployment to Iraq. "I keep thinking I'm supposed to have it all figured out by now," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "It's been 8 months. Shouldn't I be past the nightmares and the jumping at loud noises?" Sarah recognized the timeline pressure he was putting on himself, the same unrealistic expectations that had made her own recovery more difficult. "David, can I ask you something?" she said gently. "If you had a friend who'd been through what you've experienced, would you expect them to be fine after 8 months?" David paused, considering. "No, I guess not. I'd probably tell them to be patient with themselves." "So why do you think the standards are different for you?" It was the same question Dr. Thompson had asked Sarah many months ago, and she watched David's face change as the double standard became apparent. These were the moments Sarah lived for now, when she could see someone beginning to extend to themselves the same compassion they'd readily offer to others. After the formal group ended, several members lingered for informal conversation, as had become the tradition. Rachel approached Sarah as they were stacking chairs. "I wanted to thank you again," Rachel said. "Not just for that first night when you got me to come inside, but for showing me what recovery could look like. Watching you transform from someone who could barely speak about her trauma to someone who's helping others process theirs, it gave me hope when I didn't think I'd ever feel hopeful again." Sarah was touched by the recognition, but she'd also learned to share credit where it was due. "You did the work, Rachel. I just showed you that it was possible. And honestly, helping facilitate these groups has been as healing for me as any therapy I've done. There's something powerful about turning your pain into purpose." The transformation in Sarah's life extended far beyond her role with the support groups. Her relationship with Elena had deepened into a friendship that anchored both of them. They discovered that they shared not just professional interests, but a love of hiking, a passion for cooking, and a similar sense of humor that helped lighten even difficult conversations. They'd started taking weekend hiking trips together, finding that the physical challenge and natural beauty provided a different kind of therapy than talking or formal treatment. On a recent trip to a state park 2 hours outside the city, they'd sat on a cliff overlooking a valley and talked about their dreams for the future. "I've been thinking about going back to school," Sarah had confided as they watched eagles circling below them. "Maybe pursuing a degree in counseling or social work. I never thought I'd want to work in helping professions, but this peer counseling work has shown me something about myself I didn't know was there." Elena had smiled with the satisfaction of someone watching a friend discover their calling. "You'd be incredible at that. You have natural instincts for meeting people where they are, and your credibility as someone who's walked the path would be invaluable." Now, 3 months after that conversation, Sarah was enrolled in a part-time bachelor's degree program with a focus on psychology and trauma counseling. The coursework was challenging, but deeply engaging in ways her previous jobs had never been. She was learning to put theoretical frameworks around the intuitive understanding she'd developed through her own experience and peer counseling work. Her relationship with Dr. Thompson had evolved as well. While she still saw him monthly for maintenance sessions, their work together had shifted from crisis intervention to personal growth and professional development. He'd become a mentor as much as a therapist, helping her navigate the unique challenges of being a counselor who is also a trauma survivor. One of the most important skills you will need to develop, he told her during a recent session, is learning to hold space for others' pain without taking it on as your own. Your empathy is one of your greatest strengths, but it can also be a vulnerability if you don't maintain good boundaries. Sarah was learning to distinguish between healthy empathy and unhealthy absorption of others' trauma. It was delicate work requiring constant self-awareness and regular supervision, but she was developing the skills to be fully present for others without losing herself in the process. Her family relationships had continued to improve as well. Sarah's parents, who had spent months walking on eggshells around her, were finally seeing their daughter's personality and humor return. Her sister Jess had become one of her biggest supporters, regularly sharing articles about veteran mental health and checking in about her coursework and counseling work. "I'm so proud of who you're becoming," Jess had told her during their last phone call. "Not that you weren't amazing before, but watching you transform your struggle into something that helps other people, it's incredible." Sarah's physical health had improved alongside her emotional healing. The constant tension she'd carried in her shoulders and jaw had gradually released as her nervous system learned to regulate itself. Even her leg pain, while still present, was more manageable now that she wasn't fighting a constant battle with anxiety and hypervigilance. She'd started exercising regularly again, something that had seemed impossible during the worst of her PTSD symptoms. Elena had introduced her to yoga, which proved to be both physically and emotionally healing. The practice of mindful movement helped Sarah reconnect with her body in positive ways after trauma had made her feel disconnected from herself. One evening in early fall, Sarah was preparing for a particularly challenging group session. They'd planned to discuss anniversary reactions, the way trauma symptoms often intensified around the dates when traumatic events occurred. It was approaching the 2-year anniversary of the mortar attack that had killed her teammates, and Sarah had been feeling the familiar heaviness that came with memorial dates. Elena arrived early to help set up, as she often did before difficult sessions. "How are you feeling about tonight?" she asked as they arranged the chairs. "Nervous," Sarah admitted. "Talking about anniversary reactions while I'm experiencing them feels a bit like performing surgery on yourself. But I also think my current experience might help the group understand that even when you're doing better, the anniversaries can still be hard." "That's exactly the kind of authentic sharing that makes you such a powerful facilitator," Elena said. "You're not pretending to be cured or completely healed. You're showing them what recovery actually looks like: messy, nonlinear, but ultimately hopeful." The group session that night turned out to be one of their most profound. Sarah shared openly about her current struggle with the anniversary date, and her honesty opened space for others to discuss their own experiences with memorial dates, birthdays of lost friends, and other temporal triggers. "I used to think that having a bad day meant I wasn't really getting better," said Marcus, a Marine veteran who'd been attending for 6 months. "But listening to Sarah talk about still struggling, sometimes even though she's clearly healing, it helps me understand that recovery isn't about never having difficult days. It's about having better tools for managing them." After the group, as Sarah and Elena were locking up the building, Elena pulled out an envelope. "I have something for you," she said. "It's a letter of recommendation for the graduate program applications you've been working on. But I also wanted you to read it because I think you might not fully realize how far you've come." Sarah opened the letter and felt tears spring to her eyes as she read Elena's words. Sarah Mitchell represents the best of what recovery and post-traumatic growth can achieve. When I first met her 18 months ago, she was a veteran struggling with severe PTSD, convinced that she was broken beyond repair. Today, she's a peer counselor whose work has directly contributed to the healing of dozens of other veterans, a student pursuing advanced education in trauma counseling, and a person who has transformed her deepest wounds into sources of strength and wisdom. Elena, this is... Sarah's voice caught with emotion. It's the truth, Elena said simply. You've become exactly the kind of person you needed when you were struggling most. That's not a small thing. That's extraordinary. As they walked to their cars, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been convinced that survival was the best she could hope for. Now she was not just thriving, but helping others thrive as well. The anniversary of the attack came, and went with less difficulty than Sarah had expected. She spent the day with Elena and Rachel, visiting the Veterans Memorial in the city center and talking about the friends they'd lost. Instead of drowning in guilt, Sarah found herself able to honor Martinez, Rodriguez, and Johnson while also celebrating her own survival and growth. That evening, she received a text from David, the veteran who'd asked about recovery timelines in group. Thank you for showing me that healing is possible. Started therapy this week because of what you shared about your journey. Sarah smiled as she typed back. That's wonderful news. Remember, it's a process, not a destination. You've got this. As she settled into bed that night, Sarah thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, broken, isolated, convinced that her best days were behind her. That woman could never have imagined becoming someone who helped others heal, who found purpose in her pain, who experienced joy and connection alongside the ongoing work of recovery. The nightmares still came occasionally, and her legs still ached on rainy days. But these symptoms no longer defined her existence or limited her possibilities. They were simply part of the landscape of her life, whether she'd learned to dress for and navigate with skill. Sarah fell asleep that night, not to the familiar weight of despair, but to a sense of deep satisfaction about the day's work and excitement about tomorrow's possibilities. She'd learned that recovery wasn't about returning to who she'd been before the trauma, but about becoming someone new, someone stronger, more compassionate, and more purposeful because of what she'd survived and how she'd chosen to transform it. In the darkness of her bedroom, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a neighborhood at rest, Sarah Mitchell, former soldier, trauma survivor, peer counselor, and future therapist, smiled as she drifted off to sleep, knowing that she'd found her way not just back to herself, but forward to someone even better than she'd ever dreamed possible. The wounded had indeed become steady, and in her steadiness, she'd become a beacon for others still finding their way through the darkness toward their own light.